Are we on? Just a recap on my tragic situation. I have arthritis, and it affected a bone in my hand, which became increasingly difficult. So having tried everything but, I finally did surgery today. And I presume it was successful. Where I am right at this moment is I'm reasonably clear of head and mind and body, except for this left arm, which is dead. Try putting a raincoat on when your hand is dead. I found that out at 5:30 tonight. It took me about 15, and I had to get somebody to help me put it on. So that's why I'm not taking it off. Anyway, I will get it off tonight. I think getting it off is easier than putting it on. We'll find out. Anyway, this is the first of two parts on the history of Catholic moral teaching. Catholic moral teaching. And as I thought about this and started writing it, I said to myself, now it's interesting, first of all, I used the word history. And then I think I also used the word in the title, perhaps, although you can claim I didn't, and you might be right, I forget. But I may have used the word development as well. Those are, I don't want to say they're sneaky words, they're not, but they are there intentionally. I didn't reflect upon it until I started writing this masterpiece, that history and development suggest something, namely change, which is a crucial concept in the Catholic Church, and particularly a much disputed concept, maybe around many things, but particularly in the area of personal morality and particularly human sexuality. There can never be a change. That's being a bit broad, but that's kind of a position. And my remarks tonight will be intended to review the history and development of the Catholic moral tradition with a particular eye on change in this first presentation. And in the second presentation next week, we will continue with a particular focus on social ethics, which, interestingly enough, in the Catholic tradition, this is very interesting, allows for all kinds of change. It's very, very interesting. No change, and change is normal. How do you get that? Well, anyway. So I speak of the history of development. These are crucial concepts. A major theme in speaking about Catholic moral teaching, or any teaching whatsoever in the Church. It depends. Certain areas more so than others. One, of course, is the whole area of authority in the Church. That can never change. Never. For many Catholics nurtured in the pre-Vatican II Church, and the Vatican II Church here, I put it up here on the board, John the 23rd calls for a council of the Vatican on January 25th, 1959, at about 6 o'clock in the evening. I mean, it's being a bit ridiculous to say that. It was dark in Rome. He had just attended the conversion of St. Paul festivities at St. Paul outside the walls, one of the four basilicas in Rome. St. Peter's, St. John Lateran, St. Mary Major, and St. Paul outside the walls. St. Paul outside the walls has been rebuilt a number of times, and this latest one, I think, is from the 1930s. I don't know St. Paul's body may have been there. It was moved down the Appian Way by the Christians to protect it from others, etc. I have no idea about its present whereabouts. If it is at St. Paul's, I don't know. But for many Catholics, including myself, nurtured in a pre-Vatican II church, whose influence did not end on December 8th, 1965, when Vatican II came to a formal conclusion. And as I indicate here on the board, there were 4 sessions. There was a long preparation period, which is an interesting story in and of itself. There were the 4 sessions, and in between, each session went once. Most of the sessions started in September or early October, and they went until the end of the first week of December. Whatever that comes out to, a quarter in University of California terms or whatever, about 10 weeks, 12 weeks, somewhere in there. And this was a time of intense debate. It was also a time during the sessions of great learning going on, because all these experts called to Rome went around to all the language groups and spoke to all the different bishops, afternoons and evenings. And they got an incredible education in the process. Many of them had not looked at a book of theology since they were ordained. Cardinal Spellman came back from the first session of Vatican II and came to his office, and he was a very authoritarian dictat. Everybody jumped. His residence was called the Power Station, and that was known by the mayor, the police commissioner. Police commissioners met at his house. The captains were assigned in his. He chose the captains, etc. This ancient history is politics, and Spellman was a real power, both locally, nationally, internationally. But nationally through his work with the military, and a close friend of Franklin Roosevelt's for years. But nevertheless, Spellman came into his office right after the first session is over, second week of December, gets on the phone, calls Dunwoody Seminary in Yonkers, New York, and asks to speak with the professor of Old Testament there, or of Scripture, and asked him to come down to his office. He wanted to see him immediately. Now I'm blanking on his name. So when he calls, you jump. So this professor, 45 or whatever, gets in his car and zips down to 50th Street, right behind St. Patrick's, parks, comes in shaking in his boots, cold on the carpet, so to speak, and Spellman addresses him and says, "Did you write these were Paulist pamphlets on the Old Testament?" And he says, "Yes, Your Eminence, I did write them." And he says, "Fine, you're a Monsignor now." That was part of the education of Spellman. But any event, so and in between the sessions, lots of conversations going on nationally, international groups meeting between sessions, paper flying back, long before it would have been much more speeded up with internet, etc. But nevertheless, so all this stuff went on for very intense years. And of course, about 100 Protestants and Orthodox Christians were honored guests at the meeting. And on a couple of occasions, distinguished rabbis were invited to come as well, including Abraham Heschel, a very distinguished gentleman. So when the council formally closes on December 8th, 1965, notions of history and development quickly lead to questions about change. And the notion of change is hard to fathom for some Catholics whose understanding of fidelity to Christ and the gospel message and the teaching of the church through the centuries is characterized by repetition of what they have heard or seen or done. Repetition rules out change and development. I mention it, but in parenthesis with no negative intent involved. The word catechism is a word that involves repetition. That's the word. Catechisms are not theology. They are a sounding back. That's the literal translation of the sounding back of what the teaching has been. So it has a certain repetitive quality. One of the 20th century's great theologians was a professor of church history at Yale. He was a Lutheran at the time, and in later life, due to his great spiritual attraction to the Orthodox tradition, and particularly to icons. He was one of those wonderful Protestants who had a deep and reverent visual sensibility. Protestants generally, it's far too simplistic, Protestants generally have a much more oral, Bach, etc. tradition. Catholics have a visual tradition. But he was attracted to the Orthodox icon tradition, and particularly and interestingly to Mary. So later in his life, he became an Orthodox theologian. I don't know if he became a priest in the Orthodox tradition or not. I don't know. His name was Yaroslav Pelikan. He was a renowned historian, not just within church circles, but in the American Academy. In fact, what I am referring to here, a brilliant little book on tradition, was a series of lectures that he was asked to give at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. And his title was The Honoring of Tradition. That's not quite the title, but I can't quite get it. I should have a better sense of this. The first thing that he does in his lecture is distinguish between tradition and traditionalism. I have those terms up there. Pelikan put it sharply when he spoke of tradition as the living conversation that the living have with the dead. How does that grab you? Traditionalism, on the other hand, is the dead conversation that the living have with themselves. This goes beyond Pelikan's historical subtlety, and you're dealing with Campbell's cannonballs and so on here, but the traditionalism side of things would say, well, this is the way it's always been. And somebody says, well, let's look at the text. And they say, no, we don't have to. We know what they are, etc. That's the business of history. In the mid-19th century, another great church historian, John Henry Cardinal Newman, who I've written his name up there also, he was an Anglican priest for the first half of his life, a renowned scholar at Oxford, much honored and admired, who shocked the Anglican world and British society when he decided to become a Roman Catholic. And he left the Anglican tradition, became a Roman Catholic, and he was kicked out of Oxford because no Catholics could go to Oxford at that time. So he became a Roman Catholic priest of a group known as the Oratory, and spent many years in Birmingham and wrote and wrote some marvelous books which were deeply influential at Vatican II. Probably the best English-speaking theologian prior to Vatican II. I think there's a fairly general common consensus on that. He captured brilliantly the tradition that Pelikan talked about. Granting some of his Victorian style of writing, which in fact is rather brilliant, equal to Dickens or whatever, he was criticized by his contemporaries, his fellow Catholics, questioning whether or not he was a real Catholic, that sort of conversation. Criticizing him for characterizing faith as venturing forth. They argued that this was too uncertain, too risk-laden. Newman elegantly rejoined, surely Abram and Sarah ventured forth from Ur in the Chaldees when the Lord bid them to leave their home for someplace else. Genesis chapter 12, 1-3. I have watched and listened with great delight so many times as couples say to each other, yes, I'm with you no matter what, forever. Newman's emphasis on faith, indeed hope and love, as a venturing forth, rings true in my experience in marriage. There are no roadmaps, there are no guarantees. After all, sickness or health, rich or poor. We take each other's hand and venture forth, trusting only in the love between us, who is God. Wherever two or three gather together in my name, there I am in their midst. At the end of Vatican II, the Jesuit theologian Bernard Lonergan, I should have put his name up, he's a Canadian, Lonergan, Bernard, after all. He was an engineer by background. Said that the fundamental discovery of the Council was a rejection of what he called classicism, classicism, mere repetition of what was said before and done, and an acceptance of history, of the continuing venturing forth, relying on that stimulating conversation with the past, with the dead, if you will, that provides wisdom and substance for our ongoing journey. Now, another person whom I honor as my ideal of the Catholic intellectual is a man by the name of John T. Noonan. He's a professor, he was a professor of law at Notre Dame, and for many years at Bolt Hall at Berkeley. He became, I think, in the Reagan administration, a member of the Ninth Circuit Appeals Court, which meets or has, well, they're all over the West, but he sits in San Francisco as a federal judge. And he has written extensively on history and the impact on various institutions, be they medieval Christendom, the emerging banking systems, and the matter of charging interest for the use of money, or what we say is usury. For centuries, the Church condemned usury, with no exceptions, far more and far more seriously than anything we ever said about contraception. Noonan underscores that. because Scripture, Leviticus particularly, had stated that such a practice impoverishes the poor. And because it impoverishes the poor, it cannot be done. No ifs, ands, or buts. In the 15th century, however, new economic realities began to emerge. A far cry from, so to speak, our global economy today, but the beginnings of one. Venice, the Middle East, China, the Silk Trade, Northern Europe, etc. There had to be a way of establishing credit across the vast expanses. And that became known as banks. And they did charge interest. But this proved to be a great boon to people, to merchants, and to peasants alike. And the church, interestingly, stopped its condemnations of usury. Just stopped. Somebody didn't step in front of the camera and say, forget what we said over the last 3 centuries. It just stopped. And the practice became one of a reasonable charge for the use of money is perfectly all right. Unreasonable charge, of course, then you get into all kinds of arguments about what's reasonable, unreasonable, but nevertheless, usually the charging for the use of money is not per se immoral. And that changed. Because of new economic realities, the church stopped its condemnations. And Noonan points out that the church's concern and value of the dignity of poor persons is what he calls a permanent value that is not disturbed by this usury, at least in its modest and moderating force. While the teaching needed to change to ensure the continuity of this permanent value. This too resonates with Pelikan's distinction between tradition and traditionalism. Noonan, throughout my seminary days, would come and stay with the Paulists. His great mentor, after he graduated from Harvard Law School in the late 40s, was a Paulist by the name of Gene Burke. I have his picture in my room. With Gene and I, Gene is my second father. When I became pastor at the University Parish at Berkeley, John and I, who had seen one another on many occasions over the previous 35 years, had time to renew our friendship. He came for Mass, as he did every Sunday at Newman. And I mentioned to him, I said to him, John, the greatest talk I ever heard in my life, you gave when I was a deacon, just about almost ready to be ordained a priest, probably February 1968, around there. The talk was a marvel of organization. Now I'll skip over the other part. Heaven knows who might watch this on YouTube. I don't want John to be embarrassed. But in any event, the talk was a marvel of organization. He began lawyerly. I have 5 points to make in this talk. Point number 1 has 4 subtitles, A, B, C, D. Point number 2 has 3, and so on and so forth. I outlined his entire talk on 2 envelopes, 8.5 by 11 envelopes, back and front, and used those envelopes for talks I gave over the next 5 years. Maybe 40 or 50 times. Oh, Bernie, John said, I gave that same talk 100 times. Can't beat him. Anyway, the occasion of John's talk was his return from Rome for his last meeting of the Committee of International Scholars from many disciplines, including law, obviously, who had been chosen to advise Pope Paul VI on the matter of contraception. John later wrote a 900-page book not easily condensed into 2 envelopes on the subject. And I may be one of the few persons still breathing who read that book. It's a chest breaker. Rated at night. Anyway, he spoke on the history of contraception and the present choice of the church. The talk may have gone on for about 3 hours. I have no idea. Time was lost. It was that good a talk. In brief, now I've lost the 2 envelopes, and the 900-page volume I gave away a long time ago. Undoubtedly somebody else has it on their shelf unread. He noted that there were 3 reasons for the centuries-old practice of the church opposing birth control, starting almost from the 1st century, 2nd century certainly. The 3 reasons were these. There was a social, cultural, pagan disinterest in the body, in flesh and blood. In academic circles, this was understood, this was the cultural overlay. The Platonic emphasis on the soul really discounted any great value attached to the body, and hence to conception. So why bother? The same pagan cultural world, Mediterranean world, which the church lived in as a minor player, discounted severely any imperfect children, giving high value to, for instance, a young male's availability for military service. So anybody who limped. The 3rd reason, and this may strike you as interesting, women were to be available to men at all times. Pregnancy put a limit on that availability. These were the 3 reasons, the 3 energies supporting contraception, which the church opposed, and opposed contraception. Having traced instances through numerous social, political, and cultural contexts, Noonan affirmed the evangelical virtue embodied in the church's opposition to contraception. Notice that. The evangelical virtue or virtues embodied in the church's opposition to contraception. 1, we believed in the resurrection of the body. We believed in the body. The body is valuable. There is no such thing as a disembodied person. We believed in the inherent dignity of persons who were not dignified by their availability to the state, but were dignified by the fact that they existed. Yes, shockingly, we believed in women's dignity. Neither slave nor free, Jew or Greek, or as Paul put it, male or female, we are now one in Christ. Paul says that in Galatians. So given the history, the tradition, not only the negative statements of the church, but also the values the church wished to preserve and to hand on, and that's what tradition means, to hand on to the next generation, Noonan argued, might not the church's teaching change to preserve these values in our time, entrusting married couples to make conscientious decisions with regard to the number and spacing of their children? Noonan's question was indeed the majority consensus of the committee. 2 members dissented vigorously from the other 30 or so members, and this included membership that was clergy and also lay, men and women. I always forget their names. They were remarkable American Catholics. They were the founders of the Catholic family movement out of Chicago. Can't remember their names. They both have since died. They were just gems, just remarkable people. They were part of this committee as well. Maybe Noonan may be the last living member of this committee. I don't know. The 2 who opposed were Cardinal Ottaviani, head of the Congregation for Doctrine and Faith, and the American Jesuit moral theologian John Ford. They went to see Pope Paul. What's our time? Is it 20 minutes to 8?
About
4 more minutes.
Yeah, 20, yeah, I got you. I have my own clock here. I have to put everything in one pocket. Here it is. Let's see better. Okay. Noonan's question, oh, I got that. Ottaviani and Ford went to Pope Paul and advised that he reject the majority report, primarily because if Paul accepted the report, the change, note this, the change in church teaching would destroy church authority. That's the argument. The combustible connection between human sexuality and church authority is indeed troubling. Some eminent Catholic scholars have been removed from faculties because of their sympathetic or critical attention to numerous specifics within this combustible connection. I do recall, let me just use one example, not an academic. I do recall within the last few years a Catholic wife and teacher at a local Catholic grade school, I think in Illinois, it might have been Indiana. I think it's Indiana. She and her husband, after years of trying to conceive, received medical assistance, in vitro it's HIV, husband in vitro, husband, not anonymous. She received medical assistance in which the husband's sperm was medically placed in her fallopian tubes. She then, or as we properly say, they became pregnant. She was thrilled. She didn't carry around banners. She was beaming, though. The pastor, realizing that something might be up, and knowing something about her long struggle to become pregnant, and seeing his beaming teacher in the 4th grade, or whatever grade it was, inquired of her, it's hard for me to believe that somebody would do this, but inquired of her if she had conceived, quote, naturally, unquote, or through artificial means, quote unquote. When he discovered that it was the latter, the teacher was fired. A combustible connection indeed. One further example of the strange connection in at least some Catholics' imagination between human sexuality and ecclesial authority. In the late 1960s and the early 70s, and I will try to be as vague as I can so as not to injure anyone, a Jesuit professor, a Jesuit president of a university called, as a matter of courtesy, the archbishop of the diocese in which the university was. And he wished to inform him that at the university there was to be a public lecture at which a very well-known, and after the council, a lot of these European theologians made hay coming to the United States and going around and giving talks, etc. It was electric. The time was remarkable, those years. And this, I forget who it was coming to give a lecture of a European Catholic theologian. The archbishop was suspicious. What's he going to talk about? The Jesuit president said, oh, the Holy Trinity. The archbishop said, oh, for God's sakes, there's no problem there. I was worried he was going to talk about authority or sex. It is a profoundly sad comment in contrast to the numerous repeated denunciations that have emerged over centuries that in the same time frame, post-Christopher Columbus, post-extraordinary missionary expansion of the church following closely European colonialization efforts over several continents, that throughout a half a millennium, basically from 1500 to, well, I could say 1500 to 1988, whatever that works out. That's, I would say, half a millennium, give or take 12 years. That over this period of time, and it's a scandal, the church at the parish level, the school level, the university level, the diocesan level, the national associations of bishops, including the Vatican's many agencies, and indeed a long line of popes, none of them ever condemned slavery.
1988?
John Paul II finally said it's a sin. A little after the Civil War, but
Yes.
Or the war between the states, depending where you are. Slavery, as we're learning again with the case of Georgetown, slavery was a significant part of wealth production throughout the world, and most sadly within the church, with the exception of such saintly and courageous people as the Dominican Bartolomé de las Casas in the West Indies, not only silent but profited from filthy wealth. It is striking, as John Noonan notes in his wonderfully readable book, Why the Church Changes and Can't Change. I recommend many of Noonan's books, and not the heavy 900-page tomes, for God's sakes. Avoid usury, avoid contraception, unless you want to read. Perfect. He's written any number. One of his great books is, it'll come to me, but I can't get it right off the top of my head. It's 4 case studies on the American Constitution. It's fascinating. It's the, it was the Holmes Lectures at Harvard in 1976. It will come to me. I'll try to remember it. But this particular book is called Why the Church Changes and Can't Change. And he remarks that it was only in the late 1980s with Pope, now St. John Paul II, that he decreed that slavery of human beings is a grave offense against God and is a sin. Catholic moral reflection within the vast and complicated areas of person, his or her responsibilities as neighbor or family person, as citizen, as an employer, an employee, as a person in need of medical attention, to medical providers' responsibilities were areas of existent commentary over the centuries, extensive commentary over the centuries. There is an incredible written history of this. Looking at, for instance, from about 800 AD until about 1500 AD, the Vatican was the United Nations. It was the court of appeal that all countries appealed to settle cases. Even in recent history, the Church was called upon by Argentina and Chile to serve as a judge in a matter of land boundaries in the south of those two countries, Patagonia and so on, down there, where all our cruise ships go through, you know, the Magellan Straits and so on. Who owns which and what? Rather than go to war, they appealed to the Vatican to settle the issue. So this is a long history. The Vatican has been involved in these complicated and involved conversations throughout its history. Many people don't even know that. It's a sign of ignorance, but that neither here nor there. I must say, even I didn't know that, and I was at a young UC San Diego campus minister, and I was talking to a professor of history who did his dissertation under John Noonan at Berkeley. And he did it in the Canon Law Library at Berkeley, the Bolt Hall Canon Law Library, which is the second largest canon law library in the world, next to the Vatican. And I said to this fellow, why did you write on that? He says, that's where all the stuff was. And he wrote on something about international disagreements in the 13th century or something like that, and he had all the material. So, fascinating stuff. So, there were extensive commentaries. Now, the prime receiver of these commentaries were seminarians preparing for holy orders. Probably they didn't get into land disputes between Argentina and Chile. But nevertheless, there were commentaries that were drawn up that were called manuals. And these were used to train priests, or to be soon priests, so that they could hear confessions, so that they would understand the gravity of the sin or the lack of gravity of the sin, and assign proper penance for sins as they were needed. Sometimes, yes, I don't mean to be too flippant here, but box 1 and box 2, you had to line up. Okay, it's almost like that. So anyway, the manuals had great power, and they went on for centuries, up to Vatican II. Then they disappeared. Interesting. We'll get to that. The manuals derived their moral principles primarily, and this is also interesting, that the church, in appealing not just to its own members, but to the whole human family, this has been something that Catholicism has held on to, uses as, so to speak, a primary source of wisdom, what it calls human reason. Now, it's not the human reason that is the human reason of the Enlightenment. It's the human reason that is capable of understanding first principles, of going back and asking why and why and why. The Enlightenment cuts that off. Wants a more calculating sense of reason. Who profits, who loses, that kind of model. Catholicism holds that the human mind, be it baptized or not, is capable, not in every case because of sin or complications there too, but is capable of understanding the intent of God. Nothing less. Paul makes reference to the pagan's capacity to understand what God intends for his creation, chapter 2 of Romans. So in the Protestant world, generally speaking, their ethical world, which is a very rich and powerful one, is restricted to Scripture. Roman Catholics have the second source, if you will, human reason. And so we will use somewhat different arguments at times than our Protestant brothers and sisters do. We've learned from each other, happily, in the context of Vatican II and subsequently. But nevertheless, there are some interesting differences.
Excuse me. The second pillar of reason, I had always heard that tradition was kind of the second pillar of the Catholic.
It's prior to that.
Okay.
It's what the mind is capable of understanding as God's intent in terms of what are, among other things, what are the ends of this particular action that we are considering.
Okay. So would tradition be like a third pillar?
Well, it would be tradition would be the handing on of that wisdom that is gathered from reason. Reason is more primary. It's a primary source. Tradition is the means by which. And that's to some extent in the manuals. These commentaries and manuals instructed the priest on the moral principles derived from the natural law that were then enumerated in terms of laws, and with study, prayer, and the good example of other confessors, he would learn to apply the principles and laws to the particularities of each penitent, with, of course, recommendations for assigning penances appropriate to each sin and sinner. I should say each sin more than sinner. The tradition was strongly bent towards the act, not towards the actor, the person. This becomes an issue in the Vatican Council times. Moral theology was largely done in the context of the confession of sins. The confessor confronted the sinners. The law, broken, distorted, or forgotten by the sinner, was reasserted. Now, I think we should remember that this setting and practice was the occasion of astonishing conversions, and many a person was lifted up through the sacramental encounter with the merciful Christ to live lives of considerable integrity and holiness. It wasn't all dark and terrible. Yet, none of us would be here today, including me. Yet, moral theology did focus on sin, not the sinner, but sin, which was almost exclusively a matter of action. And again, almost exclusively a matter of disobedience of rules and regulations. I might add again, as I said at the beginning, pre-Vatican II Catholicism didn't end on December 8th, 1965. Many people still think this is what moral reflection is about. What did I do wrong? What did I break? What rule did I break? And what rule didn't I break? You know. Anyway. It is interesting to consider the longer tradition with regard to sin in the Catholic sensibility. Here I turn to the great poet Dante, who is also a very, very Orthodox Catholic, who notes at the beginning of the great journey into the dark forest, that emblem over the entrance to hell that reads, "Despair ye, all you who enter here." Despair, not disobedience or pride, is the core sin in the Catholic tradition. This is a great secret for some. Despair, the turning away from the one in whose image we are made, who created us joyfully exclaimed, "It is good." Creation is good. Despair, through which we utterly disvalue ourselves and others and claim it's not good. And we're not good. You're not okay, and neither am I okay. The moral tradition centered in sin and disobedience to rules and regulations would finally and historically encounter the thunderclap of 2 world wars in the European heartland of Catholicism. A thunderclap that witnessed a frightful loss of life. In France, for instance, after World War I, there were more women of marriageable age who could not marry because there were no men available to marry. 1 million men died. Some at Verdun, 100,000 in a day. My God, the atrocities were unbelievable. The brutality that swept Europe 25 years later, from the Urals to the Atlantic and from the Mediterranean to the Arctic, swept away or dislocated well over 100 million people in a 12-year period. Now, it has been my claim, and I've talked this over with, among others, Tom Stransky, who is a senior Paulist and was in his youth the secretary to Cardinal Bea at the Vatican Council and had enormous access to documents, conversations, etc. I said to Tom one day that it was a hunch of mine that one of the underlying causes of Vatican II was the world wars and the shock that that put through Europe and Catholic Europe. And I don't recall his answer with, I can't say he said, Bernie, you're right, but I think there was a nod. Homer nodded, so to speak, and I took comfort in that. I still do believe that's the case. Out of this cauldron came many changes, politically, socially, legally. Notice, in terms of this tradition of sin as breaking laws, what was the great statement made by everybody at Nuremberg and every place else? I was only following orders of duly constituted authority. And I grant you, the circumstance is, quote, the winners are judging the losers. And that's a counter-argument. But nevertheless, I do believe I am only following orders is insufficient and understood. Because, why? There's a higher appeal to conscience.
Did you see the movie Judgment at Nuremberg?
Yes.
Oh, that was
Powerful movie.
It is.
It's
really,
powerful movie.
yes,
And that's the argument.
yes.
And it's made with great elegance by Burt Lancaster as the judge.
No, Spencer Tracy is the American judge.
That's right. And
But
Burt
yes,
Lancaster
accused
is the
judge.
one who is saying, and also, what's his name? Schneider. Is this Schneider?
Maximilian Schell.
Maximilian Schneider?
Schell.
Schell. Whoops. There I go. Maximilian Schell, thank God, was resting on my knee. It would be down, I might be on the floor. That Maximilian Schell was the lawyer, and that was the argument.
Yes.
He was brilliant.
And he quotes American judges.
Jackson.
Yeah, he does. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. So, so it's fascinating to see. This is where the pendulum turns, in terms not just of Catholic moral thinking, but I think the world's moral thinking. Now, whether it stays turned or not is another question. Was the conversion deep enough and pervasive enough to create powerful change? Yes.
But now it's a shift from a rules-centered
Right.
ethics
Right.
to a
Value-centered, person-centered,
principles.
conscience, which we're going to get to shortly.
Okay.
So the discipline of moral theology was also challenged at exactly this moment. I do not wish to reduce history or the challenge or to change for moral theology to a matter simply of one person, as critical historians will sometimes scoff the great man theory, or perhaps in these days the great woman theory. We always need to recognize that anyone, however important a player, nevertheless, as the truly great person that they were, always had the capacity to say, as I forget who it is, one of the great medieval theologians who said, "If I have seen further, it is because I have stood on the shoulders of giants." It's a great line. Hold on to it and use it. That's another way of talking about tradition also. This person, the person I am referring to, did have teachers. He had collaborators, and for far and wide. He had students who have spread his influence and his vision for a renewed moral theology in, for, and to the wider world than the Catholic Church. He was a Redemptorist priest. Interestingly enough, the Redemptorists were the community out of which Father Hecker came. He left the Redemptorists and we became Paulists. But nevertheless, the Redemptorists were a religious community founded in the 18th century by St. Alphonsus Liguori, who was an important moral guide and teacher who influenced the old rigorous moral system with some new breath and balance. This priest trained at the Alfonsonium in Rome, Alphonsus Liguori, and after that spent many years teaching there. During the war, he was a chaplain, the Second World War, he was a chaplain in the German army, spending a good deal of time in the trenches of Russia and the Eastern Front, a particularly bitter experience. He mentions that he was court-martialed on 4 occasions for disobedience, for counseling soldiers in his area, in his platoon, company, regiment, whatever, not to engage in some of the most heinous actions towards both combatants and non-combatants alike. He witnessed the ordinary horrors of war, and he witnessed also the extraordinary bravery of war, of men in war, the extraordinary kindness and the deep solidarity of those he lived with. This man's name was Bernard Häring. During the 1950s and just prior to Vatican Council II, which he fully and most effectively worked with as what is called a peritus, which means an expert, he wrote his 3-volume masterpiece called The Law of Christ. This is what changes Catholic moral theology. Cutting through the centuries of manual commentaries, he simply said that all moral theology leads one to be a better disciple of Jesus. With Häring and many others, first
Say
in
that again.
Moral theology leads one to be a better disciple of Jesus. With Häring and many others, first in Europe and slowly moving out to touch other continents, moral theology needed the refreshment of the Bible in the Catholic world, reason, etc. And Häring, you begin to get heavy doses of biblical theology coming in now with Vatican II. And that's what sprung Spellman to make his priest a Monsignor. He said, well, we never looked at the Bible after he was ordained in 1915. He never bothered, whatever. Anyway, not only putting people in touch with the Bible, but also the great theologians of the church, the great tradition. It needs to be close to and to remember and encourage the witness of those men and women whom Häring met on the battlefields of Eastern Europe. One of those collaborators, consciously or not, with Häring was Cardinal Suhard of Paris. In 1948, he wrote a pastoral letter to his fellow French Catholics. Many were dispirited by the war and their varied collaborations with the Nazi occupiers. Of course, there was a romanticized, well, there were a few sympathizers with the Nazis, but all the rest of us were on the right side. Well, as it turned out, everybody, they all admitted, everybody's hands was dirty. At the end of the war, Pius XII realized there was major problems with this first daughter of the church, France, and what he was going to do with the church in France. De Gaulle had returned, and De Gaulle was a pious Catholic, bar none, and saw the world in total clarity. And for de Gaulle, every bishop in France had to be fired because they were all collaborators. Pius understood this as too much of a concession to the state. So Pius sent his great negotiator, this fat little Italian guy who had spent most of the last 30 years in the East, in Romania and in Constantinople. He sent him to Paris as a diplomat. His name was Angelo Roncalli, chubby little guy who becomes John the 23rd eventually. Roncalli snookered de Gaulle, which had to be one of the great accomplishments in life, down to one bishop had to go. And as a result, I forget the lineage for this particular cardinal in Paris. Cardinal Suhard is the Archbishop of Paris in 1948. He writes this letter to Parisian Catholics of diocese or archdiocese of Paris, many dispirited by their collaborations, urging them to follow Christ, who calls them to discipleship. And he said this: "Your witness is crucial in this dark hour, when so many are tempted to despair of God and of themselves. Live your lives," Suhard said, "in such a way that others can only find your life inexplicable unless there is a God who loves you and them." Yes?
I'm not following here. What did de Gaulle... de Gaulle didn't have any sort of power to dismiss bishops, did he?
He had a heck of a lot of power.
Well, I mean...
It's called the power of the street, and the power of the press,
Oh, okay.
and the power of everything else.
Public opinion.
You
Okay.
betcha.
Okay, I got you.
And this little fat guy schmoozed him. I don't know what de Gaulle really thought at all. Who did? Anyway, in the lead up to and through and following Vatican II, Hering and numerous collaborators, including many bishops, sought to reshape moral theology project fundamentally around discipleship in Christ, and marked and characterized by a shift from an exclusive focus on sin and the sinner to a vision both of freedom and responsibility of the Christian. Following the ancient traditions of Christianity, articulated so clearly by Thomas Aquinas, conscience of the person was restored to its rightful and central place. Law and regulations are instructors of conscience. They do not take the place of conscience. They can never replace personal conscience. Thomas's position was this in a nutshell. If you do not follow your conscience, and the path that you choose happens to be the right path, you are wrong. If you follow your conscience, and what you end up doing, because of invincible ignorance or whatever we want to say, it turns out that what you did was wrong, you're right. Okay?
And what the church says has nothing to do with it?
Please. That's right. That's right.
Whoa.
Conscience is supreme. How about that? Now, conscience has to be informed by the church. Somebody who says, "Oh, I don't pay attention to the church at all," that's not a rightly formed conscience. Okay? We'll get to this in terms of his definition of conscience, which I'll give to you in a moment. But this reminds me of how many people have you met, and all of us have met in the last 3 years, who are stunned by Francis and the things he has said. And we go around saying, they come around saying to us, "Gee, this is a big change. This is, wow. Wow. Did they ever hear of Jesus? Be merciful, forgive. That's Francis's position. He's modeling what Hering was talking about, so to speak. And it seems to us as being so new. It's not. It's as old as Jesus. Anyway, and as old as the prophets. Dare I just become somebody who forgets the Jewish history in this too. I was fortunate on a spring Sunday morning in 1965 to be an altar server of all things, an altar boy, but I wasn't a boy. But anyway, for Father Herring at Trinity College in Washington, D.C., where I had at least one girlfriend from a few years before I became a seminarian. Afterwards, we had breakfast together. What an experience for me. The council was moving towards its final session in the fall, the following fall, and among the unfinished business was something called Schema 13, which just at the close of session 3 received a new title, The Pastoral Constitution on the Church in the Modern World. Herring was deeply involved in forming and revising the text in connection with a section of the Constitution dealing with international cooperation, especially in so recently the post-colonial world. Remember, this is after the Second World War, France, Britain, Portugal, all of the European powers are withdrawing, slowly or quickly, from places such as, dare I mention it, Vietnam, places, dare I mention it, Aden, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, the French from Syria, all of Africa, etc., withdrawing. They all become decolonialized in some sense, which is an issue for subsequent generations to evaluate. Did we get really decolonialized or whatever? But nevertheless, you have this change, this remarkable change that's happening in the world. Herring had invited the distinguished Catholic and professor of politics, philosophy, and economics at Oxford, Barbara Ward. She wrote a book on poverty called Rich Nations, Poor Nations. Still around, I hope, which challenged Lyndon Johnson. And Johnson created Head Start, early education programs, countless other programs which became clustered under the War on Poverty, which some say didn't work at all, but a lot of kids got a leg up. Nevertheless, Barbara Ward spoke to the bishops. Now, at the breakfast table that morning, Herring drew me and this other Paulist I was with into his vision with amazing laughter as he noted the many bishops who were stunned, utterly confused, to have a woman talk to them. Talk to them authoritatively. She stood up, they sat down. Body language. Herring gleefully, or sardonically, rolled his eyes, recounting their amazement. It was impossible for some of them to conceive that a woman could be intelligent, and utterly beyond imagining that she would have a PhD. Talk about crossing the Rubicon. As we come towards the close of this first presentation on the history of the development of moral theology and the Catholic tradition, I want to draw your attention, in keeping with Herring's comments at that breakfast long ago, to some remarkable statistical facts about the post-Vatican II Church, which influence moral theology and the doing of moral theology. In 1965, 75% of the Catholic world lived in Europe and North America. It was predominantly white. In 2015, 80% of the Catholic world lives outside of Europe and North America. If you don't think this changes the ball game, you aren't paying attention.
Say that again.
What?
What you
2015,
just said.
80%.
No.
It goes 75%
Yeah,
is North American Europe, 1965.
yeah.
In 2015, 80% is outside of Europe and North America. This changes the whole conversation.
Yeah.
We see a snippet of this in our American politics, but I won't go into that.
No, no.
Prior to 1965, the information system, quote unquote, of Catholicism was such, not unlike, if any of you love old movies as I do, the RKO Pictures opening logo in those old movies, even I think Citizen Kane, which was an RKO film. It has a kind of somewhat like an Eiffel Tower-like structure standing somewhere in Europe or somewhere over there. The map is a little bit unclear, but it's clearly not the North America. It's over there, and it's buzzing out, buzzing, buzzing, buzzing. RKO Pictures. Eiffel Tower-like radio signals located in one place. And it has one signal to be received by many receivers throughout the rest of the world. Now, these receivers have no way of sending messages back. This is 1965. Okay. This is about to change. But this is another dimension of this. One of the things about Vatican II that those in Rome, Cardinal Ottaviani and some of his close friends, they were very concerned about having a council in Rome. And the issue they were very astute. If we get all these people together, a couple of thousand bishops, they're going to talk to each other. They're going to start comparing notes. They're going to start saying, well, what did they say to you? What did they say to me? This is nonsense. Let's talk to each other. They didn't want that. So one of the things they wanted to do was to make sure the council ended in about 4 weeks. So they were ready to ram through documents that they thought reflected the pre-Vatican II church. This is the way it is, this is the way it's always been. And there came a time, first week, second week of Vatican II, a German bishop stood up and said, no way, we're not doing business like that. We'll elect all of our own people, the committees designated by the Congregation for the Doctrine and Faith will not appoint everybody to be on a committee, their favorites. We, the bishops, will do this. And that changed the whole ballgame. And it took several years. It's like somebody asked me recently, how long does it take the church to turn around? Well, I said, do you know a super tanker out in the ocean takes 17 miles to stop? Now we get into turning around, it's a little bit longer. So it takes enormous energy to turn institutions around. So this is one of the things that's going on at Vatican II. One of the things that's indicated by this Eiffel Tower sending one message out to all these receivers is that it is, in corporate language, a top-down model. When I was in first year of theology, I was in college, 1959, and the priest, the Jesuit teaching theology, so we thought, I guess, told us pridefully that Shell Oil had given the Catholic Church the highest marks for organizational stability. The Eiffel Tower, we know who's in the corner office, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All that stuff. but it reflects assumptions that are no longer tolerable or acceptable. With this top-down model, there was little or no need for dialogue. And dialogue becomes the critical central term of Vatican II. It was the mirror image of a deductive method followed for many centuries, especially in the area of personal morality. It was less so in the area of social ethics or social morality, and we'll see that next week. There, the model is inductive. Deductive is you start with the principles, and it's like a syllogism. You just work it right down. Brrr. Everybody is mortal. John is mortal. John, or every human being is mortal. John is mortal. John is human, or whatever it is. John is human, whichever way you go. Well, that, it's perfect. But what about circumstances? What about any number of historical issues, etc.? The inductive method starts with on the ground, with the details, with the circumstances, what's going on, who's pushing whom into the river, etc., etc. Okay? A pastoral model for the church for many years, God bless them, and it has to go on, pulling people out of the river who are drowning. Now, occasionally there are heroes and heroines who say, let's go upstream and find out who's doing the pushing. Okay? That's a whole other game. But also an important moral question. Okay? Aside from the informative system model, which was not unknown in the corporate and governmental and other institutions throughout the world, including Shell Oil, and the remarkable population configuration change in the last 40 or 50 years in the Roman Catholic Church, there is a third significant change within the Catholic Church that has taken place with regard to theology and moral theology, and particularly as they are continuing ecclesial disciplines within the Church. This affects both theology, moral theology, biblical theology, Bible, liturgy, etc., all different subsettings. With reference to Barbara Ward in mind, the post-Vatican II professional academic world has gone through an astonishing transformation. Prior to Vatican II, almost all the Catholic academic institutions of ecclesial learning were male, and they were clerical almost entirely. In the last 50 years, the scene has changed. When the Catholic Theological Society of America was established in December of 1946 at St. Paul the Apostle Church on 59th Street in New York, at the Paulist Father's place, there were 13 co-signers of that original document establishing. 2 of them were Paulists. The other 13 were all priests, either from Catholic University, from Philadelphia, from Dunwoody, and from Boston. Talk about a geographical narrowness. Huh? They were all priests. I think they were all Irish. There you go, even a further subset. Huh? Talk about limiting your horizons. 50 years later, what I call the Catholic Theological Society of America, or CTSA, and its related organizations, morals, ethics, scripture, liturgy, etc., even canon law, are now a majority lay people. Tremendous change, and a significant, and in some respects, majority presence of women holding positions of administrative and institutional leadership in these organizations. And they have the academic talent to back them up. With talented women and people of color, both in the United States and Europe, and in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Remember that initial RKO image. Now you have people building platforms, internet, whatever. Everybody's talking to everybody else. The feminist, the post-colonial, the theology, as people say, from below, from the poor and the powerless, has certainly changed and enriched Catholic contribution to our being disciples of Jesus. Let us close by looking briefly at two documents or two statements of the Council's final great constitution on the Church in the modern world. Now that's behind me, right? Okay, I'm going to sit here and hopefully I can see it. Well, you want to turn it on? Oh, I have to move it. So can you move it for me as I ask you to?
I can't. Or do you just want?
Well,
you
I can't see it. That's the problem.
Yeah.
And I'm afraid if I get up and this hand goes down, I go down. Okay, so this is Gaudium et Spes. Is it up?
Yes.
Okay, this was joy and hope. And most Vatican or Roman documents are named, are written in Latin. Well, not all, they weren't all written in Latin, but certainly for Vatican II, they were all written in Latin. And the titles are traditionally taken from the first words of the document. So you will see the joys and the hopes, the griefs and the anxieties of men of this age, especially those who are poor or in any way afflicted. These too are the joys and hopes, griefs and anxieties of the followers of Christ. United in Christ, they are led by the Holy Spirit. Let me just stop before I get there. I just want to touch upon what is really the key word in this whole document. And it's a preposition of all things. Go back up, the pastoral constitution on the Church in the modern world. If this document had been written 10 years previously, it could very well have been the pastoral constitution of the Church against the modern world. Because Roman Catholicism understood itself as outside this murky, sinful world. We were a perfect institution. Shell Oil, in fact, had told us. Well, anyway, go there too long. But that we were a perfect institution. And we had no need of the world in some fundamental sense. It doesn't mean that people weren't pastoral, gracious, kind, and good. They certainly were. There were many, my grandmother and countless others, etc., etc. And enormous acts of charity and grace done by many. But in the modern world is a commitment that could not have been made without that previous experience, particularly the extraordinary, painful experience of World War I and II. All of a sudden, we realize we're in this together. One of the things that happens 2 years before Gaudium et Spes, and it's just before John the 23rd dies. Well, it's 1962. Some of us remember this. I do. It was the only time we could have television in the dining room in the seminary as we're eating dinner. What's on? President Kennedy telling us about Cuba, whatever it was, Cuba and the missiles. First we heard about it. Well, the 10 previous days, we had come close to nuclear annihilation. Now, one of the central players in negotiating a settlement was John the 23rd. He was the only one Kennedy and Khrushchev trusted. They didn't trust each other, but they trusted this fat old guy. And he brokered, didn't write all the language or everything else, of course not, but he got them together to make this peace, to prevent nuclear annihilation. So this idea that we are an island unto ourselves is false. Long before the internet, false. We are all affected by one another. So, the rest of the statement, paragraphs 1 and 2, I leave to your reading as you wish, or anytime you get a copy and read it. What I want to do in close is turn to the second document, which I forget where it begins, maybe the French theological ethicist Philippe Bourdain. Can you pick that up?
How far is it?
Well, it should not be too far down. You have 3 subheadings: the intimate bond between church and mankind, for whom the message is intended, and service to be offered to humanity. Then it breaks off, and then the next thing, I don't know what the next thing is, but what I'm looking for is the French theological ethicist Philippe Bourdain. Do you see that? It's about conscience. Go to the end and then work your way back. You got it? Okay. Just look at that. Read that. The whole thing is worth reading. Herring was such a critical player in shaping this document. And the French ethicist Philippe Bourdain argues in his work on moral theology that the church conveyed a sympathy for the human condition, especially in all its anxieties, stood in confident solidarity with the world, not judging the world, not standing over against it, etc., etc. The entire experience of ambivalence so affected the world in its tumultuous changes in the 1960s was positively entertained and engaged. Out of the framework of the Council shaped its teaching on conscience, evidently indebted to Herring's extensive description of conscience in the law of Christ. His work anticipated, inspired, and formed some of the most important words from the Council, the now famous definition of conscience, which deserves to be quoted in its entirety. I would underscore that church constitutions of councils have the highest authority, higher than papal encyclicals, okay? As far as teaching. They're very, very important. So here we go. Just if you want to read it there. In the depths of his conscience, man detects. Let you read it. I'm not going to. Next week, I will give you these documents. I forgot about making copies tonight. Apropos your initial observation, I have them inside, but given my...
You had something else on your mind
I didn't have it
tonight?
on my mind. I had my arm that limited my abilities. So next week I'll be a little more flexible, and I have some materials I'll give you, including this, and also including, I'm not going to go through it now, but something worth looking at. I did mention at a little before, again with this notion of the Eiffel Tower now springing up in a variety of locations, that a number of theologians around the world are taking the experience of the poor, of the marginalized, as fundamental data for Christian reflection. Okay? And so you have, in many parts of the world, men and women both native European missionaries, clerical lay, working with communities, reading the Bible, having the people give their understanding of Jesus, how they understand. One of my close friends, a Paulist, is a liturgist, and his name is Tom Kane. And some years ago, Tom had wonderful ways of working. He's at the Jesuit School of Theology in New England, in Boston, and for 35 years. God, it seemed like he was going on a sabbatical every other year. I don't know how he wangled us. And he wangled the money, which is pretty good, too. And one of the things he did over 2 or 3 or 4 years, for a semester at least, is he went to, the one place he went to was Africa. And he started on the east coast of Africa, be it Mozambique or wherever, and he went across in a kind of an arc through what was then the Belgian Congo, it may now be the Congo, over to Nigeria on the west coast. The west coast. And what he did is he looked at liturgy and prayer as it was done by the people, and particularly, given Tom's interest, done with a focus on dance, on the use of the body, and so on. And it's extraordinary. There are many, many different expressions. They're wonderful. And in the first place he went to, in Mozambique or wherever it was, there was a community of cloistered nuns that everyone went to, particularly Europeans, to find out what's going on in liturgy. Now, right across the street is the cathedral of the archdiocese, and there is a black archbishop there. He has a great organ in the church. No drums. Bach, whatever. Now, the nuns are across the street, and they have every instrument you can find in any village in that whole world. And they are developing prayer rituals around dance, around silence, around vocal and sung prayer, and so on and so forth. It's astonishing. Now, again, this is a Barbara Ward point to some extent. The sister who is the abbess of the community has her doctorate from the Institut Catholique in Paris. This is no schmoo. This is no schmoo. And this is, world class people. Anyway, the archbishop will not go anywhere near the nuns because they represent what? The opposition? I don't know. The people? I mean, God knows. Talk about a crazy world. But this is the way things are. And maybe they've changed, let's hope, over the years. But and throughout Africa he went. And it's remarkable to see how that has developed, that tradition of coming together. And when they come together, it's no, Mass has to be out in an hour, Father. We have to clear the parking lot, and so on for the next Mass and all that sort of thing. Mass goes on for 3 hours. No time. It's a time for the community to come together. And people walk. I mean, we're not talking about VWs coming in. I mean, they walk 10 or 15 miles to get there. And it's the whole prayerful process of coming together that's part of this. So it's that kind of experience, that kind of prayer life, that kind of liturgy, which is not to be simply imposed upon Grand Rapids folks like us, but is part of our church. And how do we adjust to that? How do we think about it? How do we make use of it, etc. So, and as far as the moral questions are concerned, they are questions that focus strongly around the questions of justice and the questions of, as I used before, who's pushing whom into the water. And let's find out. Let's have a much more just society. So that's the world that these theologians are acting out of. Sometimes with some strained tension with European or Anglo theologians who want to tell them, no, we know what's good for you. And they're saying, wait a minute, we've had that for 100 years. That's colonialism. We have a different world now. So that's the world we're in. So these are some of the qualities of change. And next week we'll look at social justice and some of the issues that have appeared there. And I'll give you all that stuff then. Okay? Do you have any questions? Well, let's get somebody else.
This statement on conscience.
Yes.
You know, I like to believe that, but is it every human has a conscience?
Yes.
What happened? You could pick up the New York Times or look at the evening news, and you say, all these terrible deeds.
Yes.
Where was their conscience?
That's right. That's right. So you do have that moment there at the end where it says, for a conscience which by degrees grows practically sightless as a result of habitual sin. That's, don't forget, this isn't all joy and smiles and cookies, and milk. I mean, this is pretty serious stuff. It still respects sin, but now it's going to talk about conscience, not only in terms of the individual's responsibility, okay, and failures there too, but also the social dimensions of conscience, of who says, and why do we say, I mean, all the tough questions. There's no simple answer here. In general, there's no simple answer. Very, very difficult. It's a matter of dialogue. But all the issues we've gone through in this country in the last few years, in Ferguson, in Baltimore, and various other parts in the country with regard to the police and the use of violence. Now we say, well, it's some black person who started it all. It's a very convenient perspective to have. Is that in fact the case? One of the things that I'm intrigued by, I mentioned is not, well, I'm being somewhat argumentative, but I don't mean to be. There are lots of bad people around, and people who act poorly. But how come in all of these encounters, 100 blacks die and 2 whites? Translate that to Israel. Palestinians, the Israelis tell us all the time, look at all our people dying, and I'm not, that's not right at all. 15 or 20 in a short, and 2,000 in Gaza. And every home, hospital, place of business is leveled. It's uninhabitable. I mean, is this only one-sided? I mean, it's multi-sided. And we have to be fair and honest about that. And that's the difficult question in terms of a renewed sense of moral theology. John Locke, a great political figure and important in the formation of the Declaration of Independence, formator, there I use the term for Thomas Jefferson. John Locke, who frankly in his own personal life had no use for religion, but thought it useful. How nice of him. Thought it useful. Why? Well, it kept the poor in line. So that religion was important to keep the poor in line so they wouldn't rebel. And they would be obedient to our laws. Dialogue, Nat Turner, et cetera, et cetera. So Locke is a great champion of religion. And religion is understood, even contemporaneously. I mean, at a White House dinner that will, well, I can mention this. Theodore Hesburgh was sitting at the table with George H.W. Bush, Vice President, with his wife, and George H.W. turned to Father Hesburgh. It was right after those 4 women were murdered, raped and murdered in Salvador. And Bush turns to him and says, Father Hesburgh, why can't you get your women to be better Christians? You know, talk about blaming the victims for the crime. Oh my God. And what they were doing was helping the campesinos to learn how to read. Why? So that they would know their rights. And not just be settled with the charity that is offered to them once a year. We'll give you a fiesta, 1 day off, then back to work, 7 days a week, you know, etc.
So Hesburgh told him what a stupid thing
Oh,
to say.
Hesburgh gave it to him, yeah. I don't know what happened as a result of that. But that's emblematic of a kind of a view with regard to religion, although it breaks out of that occasionally and serves as and we'll see this next week. We talk about war and peace and some other issues, nuclear arms and the American efforts in that regard. Yes, Ray, excuse me.
We'll probably get into this next week when we get into social conscience and social morality and so forth. But I guess my concern is when you put personal conscience at kind of as the highest authority.
That's Thomas Aquinas.
Okay, then well, you or
no, it's not me. Believe me, friend.
I didn't mean it that way.
No, it's not, sir. Well, I want to correct that right away. This is the Catholic tradition.
Okay, but what is there such a concept as social conscience, and you know, we form? Can you really separate the personal from the social conscience? I mean, is there a?
It's a good question. There is something called, you know, Margaret Thatcher, notwithstanding, who said there's no such thing as society. Well, she was wrong, utterly, completely wrong. She wants to make everything personal, as long as she's number one. You know, we win. You know, goody goody, another trophy. But social reality. Again, I'm going back. Remember that circle I drew? I can't do it tonight. I'll do it next week. That famous circle from Talcott Parsons. You know, economics, politics, and values underneath. And the big thing is that society. And culture generates politics and economics. Politics assesses who gets what of the pie, so to speak, of the goods of life that are available to us. Okay? And values inform that. So the issue is, what is the nature of that society? And who's included in that society? It's very interesting. I presume you've gotten your earful with this once or twice. I certainly have. Well, Father, that's your opinion. Usually spoken by a very, very well-informed woman who is saying, well, Sandra Schneider's is my great favorite. She's a scripture scholar and doesn't take many prisoners. And Sandra is, you know, will come right back at you and say, well, that's the perspective of a male-dominated world, all right? Now, that can be overworked, I grant you, and I think even Sandra would accept that as having, you know, it's not the answer to everything. But it's worth bringing that into the conversation so that we will be able to understand different perspectives. I would presume that even, well, there was a wonderful Catholic theologian, Margaret Farley, she was president of the Catholic Theological Society one year. She was an ethicist, taught at Yale. And she got her doctorate at Yale. And when she got her doctorate at Yale, she was the only woman in the classroom. And she was in her religious habit. I don't know what she was, a Dominican or whatever. And she got her doctorate. And later on, she came back to teach at Yale. And by that point, at Yale, all of her students in her class were women. And this one guy came into the class. He had been a lawyer at one of the largest and most prestigious law firms in New York. He had retired from that law firm, and he wanted to be a Catholic deacon. And he was putting himself, and he's a good friend of mine, putting himself through Yale Divinity School in order to get an MDiv. All right? It's about 6'5", 300. I wouldn't want to mess with Billy. I never messed with Billy. His younger brothers, I messed a little bit, but they were bigger than me too. Anyway, Billy came into the class to take her class. Margaret, he was the only male. And the women wanted to throw him out. This is only for women. And Margaret Foley said, 25 years ago, the shoe was on the other foot.